All right, so welcome back. Previous video walked you through certain tactics, certain strategies you might use to learn history, to remember history. And at the end of it, I mentioned to you that we're about to get into British North America. So this is what this one's about. This first section is about the English colonies. When you hear someone say British North America, they're talking about the original 13 English colonies. So this is a map real quick of colonial holdings and on the North American continent, European holdings, excuse me, on the North American continent. In the 1700s, you can see some control by France, some territories controlled by France and Great Britain, some holdings by Spain. You've got some of the Southwest here. Florida, Mexico is down here. It's not on this map, but that's some of the European colonial holdings on North America. So as we go through these PowerPoints, what you're going to notice is that some of the words are yellow. Some PowerPoints, they may be red or blue or green or some color like that, depending on the color scheme of the actual PowerPoint. I'll try to make it as clear as possible. If it is in a color other than white or black, chances are you need to get it in your notes. So the notes, the handouts that you'll get from me will have, the words colonies, mercantilism. It might be a graphic organizer that you've got. It might be a set of Cornell notes, or you might be taking your own 2 or 3 column notes or making your own mind map or whatever. If it's in a color coded, you need to get it, especially if it's underlined like this right here, colonies, mercantilism. For instance, the word colonies is underlined, that's your term. The definition is here, italicized. It's not always the same in every PowerPoint. Sometimes it's not underlined, sometimes it's not italicized, but I try to go through and color code everything you need to get for this course. So it'll help you with a project we may be working on, a quiz you may have, and so on and so on. So go ahead and establish that right up front. So let's get into the content. What are colonies? Why would you, if you were a king or a queen or an emperor or whatever, want colonies? So colonies are territories, land, cities, as we know them now, states, whatever, established by a government, a king or a queen, in a foreign land. It's a home away from home. The English colonies, the British colonies, the 13 colonies that were originally British colonies, they were set up on a basis of what's called mercantilism. Basically, they're there to make money for the government, the British government at the time, make money for the parent country. How do you do this? You export more than you import. Exports are greater than imports, right here. So the countries want to sell more than they are buying, basically. That makes sense. It should make sense to you. You always want to make more money than you spend, so you've got more left over. You're going to make more money. This is in terms of the British government. It's a favorable balance of trade. They want these for a favorable balance of trade. Make as much money as they can. There were 3 geographic regions in the original colonies. New England, the middle colonies, you may see them as the mid-Atlantic colonies. Sometimes you might see New England as northern colonies, same thing, and the southern colonies. This is a quick list of those colonies. Your key colonies here, color-coded. Your key New England colonies are Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Your key middle colonies or mid-Atlantic colonies, New York and Pennsylvania are the big ones. Your key southern colonies, Virginia and South Carolina. And there's others there that you see, and they're color-coded here on this map for you. Oh, sorry. So how is the economy decided in these colonies? As we all know, in today's world, the economy is very important. Presidential candidates, people running for president, the current president, whoever it is, whoever wants power, whatever politician wants power, they need to have some kind of good economic plan. That is the same now. It was the same 300, 400, 500 years ago. So geography determines your economy in the colonial times. There's a reason why the southern colonies, you saw plantation farmers and slavery and things like that, and you didn't see as much of that up north. The colonists had to use the natural resources at their disposal. They had to use what resources were available to them to survive and to make a living. So in the South, you see fertile land, a longer growing season. It's warmer. I think we all know that. It's warmer for longer here, more daylight hours typically, versus up north in the New England colonies, they're a colder climate. They're closer to the Atlantic Ocean. They have shorter growing season. So they have to make the best of what they have based on their geography, based on their climate. It's worth noting here at the bottom, all three regions have farming. You may see something about this on a quiz or test and some other materials. It'll ask you which regions had farming. They all had farming, but they had different crops and they served different purposes. So the Southern economy, we'll start with this one. It's based on staple crops. These are crops that are in large demand. They drive the economy. And you see a plantation system pop up in the South. Those plantations are just large family-owned farms. These are your wealthy landowners. You'll hear me say the term rich white guys a lot. That's these guys. So some South Carolina examples of cash crops: tobacco, rice, indigo. What we see very quickly is the labor in the South, as far as these wealthy landowners, these rich white guys are concerned, is this labor requires slaves or indentured servants. So, and I'll get more into that in just a second. Southern society and politics, dominated by the gentry. There's that word that I went over really quickly with you in the previous PowerPoint. It's a wealthy upper class. We get the term gentleman from gentry. Most Southerners were slaves or indentured servants. By the 1700s, there were more slaves in South Carolina alone than there were free colonists in South Carolina. Slaves outnumbered free people. Slaves are owned like property, while indentured servants, they worked off their debt for passage to the New World. So let me explain that real quick. If you were an indentured servant, you come over on a boat, you didn't have the money to pay for that trip, so you agree by kind of like a contract to work for what would usually be 7 years for one of these wealthy landowners. And you would work off your debt for passage to the New World, and you might one day turn into a slave owner or manage indentured servants or what have you. But anyway, because of this concentration on farming and things like that, what we see is that there's no cities or urban centers of commerce, business, trade that develop in the South. There's no big cities that develop in the South. Everything's farming and driven by that system. So we see a hierarchy of Southern society. The smallest number of people are your gentry, your wealthy. These days you may hear the term one percenters. 1% of the people in the US have 98% of the wealth in the US. That's your billionaires today. That's these guys right here. Then you have poor whites and indentured servants. They're free, but they don't have a whole lot of money. And then you've got your largest group, your slaves. These are just some pics to kind of give you an idea of this Southern way of life. You've got a very stereotypical, this is from some movie, stereotypical shot of a plantation owner, very Colonel Sanders-esque there. You've got a painting here of an indentured servant or a couple of indentured servants working in a tobacco field. This is most likely tobacco. And you've got a modern day shot of a plantation home. A lot of these are still up. You've probably seen them around different places. This is a print or a painting of a tobacco plantation. You've got your slave owners here, and you've got slaves looking very primitive. This is just the way things were basically advertised back then. May not be great to see it this way, but it's just the way things were back then. We'll have discussions about that in class as we go, how you've got to keep in mind the way things were 200, 300, 400 years ago. It's not the same. You can't think about it the same way in 2020. Southern religion. Most Southerners are members of the Anglican Church, Church of England. There wasn't a whole lot of focus on religion or education because the Southern colonies were all about money, all about that plantation life. For example, the Virginia Company, it was this company that creates the headright system. Basically, if you agree to settle a colony and make money for the Virginia Company and therefore the British government, you get 50 acres to farm and establish a colony. What's an acre? If you look out at the reservation outside, or when you go to the reservation for a football game, if you look at roughly the length of the football field, and it's really about 10-yard line down to the end zone, sideline to sideline, that's an acre, roughly. So 50 of those, you get that much land, you make money for the crown, etc. Some important Southern leaders. You got John Smith. He was an important leader of Jamestown. It's the first permanent English settlement established in 1607. John Rolfe is probably the bigger name. You recognize John Smith from the movie Pocahontas if you've watched that movie. John Rolfe is probably the more important one. He made the colony successful with the discovery of tobacco. It would become the most important cash crop in the South for a long time until cotton would come along. New England economy. Up north, they rely heavily on the Atlantic Ocean. They did have farming, but it's too cold for large-scale farms. You see family farms. It's called subsistence farming. It's kind of tough to say. Basically, you grew enough to feed your family. Key industries up north, fishing, trade, shipbuilding. It's all about trade. Boston, Massachusetts becomes probably the most important city in New England. Based around the Puritan Church, a strict religious society. It was a central part of New England, central part of life. It drove every part of society. If you did not do things the way they thought you should, you might get banished. One example of this, we'll talk about it more in class, is the Salem witch trials. First major focus of public education came out of the New England colonies from the Puritans. The priority here was so everyone could read the Bible and be good Puritans. Much more equal society than the South. There wasn't a heavy focus on slavery up north. You see some cartoons here about the Salem witch trials. Again, we'll talk more about this stuff in class. Religion, again, Puritans drove everything. The church drove everything. All about pure biblical teaching. They came over here because they're unhappy with the Church of England, the Church of the South, if you remember that from a few slides ago. Religious freedom for themselves, not for others. They want to set a good example for the rest of the world, become a city upon a hill, a shining example for everyone to admire and aspire to be like. Some important leaders in New England. John Winthrop, he's the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He calls the colony the city upon a hill. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, they founded Rhode Island after they were kicked out of Puritan Massachusetts. They didn't quite do things the way they thought they should. This is a quote about city upon a hill. I'm not going to read it for the sake of time here, but we will discuss this later in a separate presentation or in class. The economy of the middle colonies is based on a blend of farming and commerce or trade. Important crops here, wheat, barley, things like that. Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, the most important cities in the middle colonies. Society in the middle colonies. They're more diverse, more religiously tolerant region. They're much more diverse because they had lots of different people. They weren't just coming from England. They were coming from other countries in Europe. They're much more open-minded. They came home for the Quakers, most famous religious group out of the middle colonies, based on equality. They didn't recognize class differences. They promoted equality of the sexes. They practiced pacifism, which is nonviolence, and they wanted to deal fairly with Native Americans. Religion, again, Quakers were the most important religious group. It was originally a Dutch colony, New York was, much more diverse, and it attracted a variety of religious groups. Important people in the middle colonies. William Penn's probably the most famous. He's the founder of Pennsylvania, leader of the Quakers. He founded it as a society of friends. You might recognize this figure here on Quaker oatmeal. It's based on a Quaker, William Penn. And we'll discuss what Quaker means later on another time in class. So some key terms here. What is salutary neglect? Because we live so far, we being the colonists, so far from England, 1,000 miles away, British basically let us govern ourselves. We got a long history of self-government. We'll dive deeper into this later in class. Representative governments. Colonies establish representative governments where people elect their own officials and have a voice. This is actually based on British government. We'll dive deeper into this later also. Some examples, the House of Burgesses, Mayflower Compact, town meetings. We'll get more into this later. You can see more of this separately as you dig into this PowerPoint a little more on your own. So colonists start taking charge. They got town meetings. You have the Mayflower Compact, which is the first written set of rules in the colonies for Pilgrims, Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, based on free consent of the people. Again, these are all ideas based on British government. We'll get more into this later. And finally, the role of women and minorities. Colonial women did have more rights than in the New World and in England, but they're still considered second-class citizens. Again, most African Americans, blacks, African Americans wasn't a term then, it was confined to slavery, and Native Americans were not considered citizens. So again, we'll dig more into this at another time. In the next section, will be in the next video. Get to it.